Okay, hello and welcome to everyone. I appreciate all the people who are here and the people who are online. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I'm the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, and today's presentation, which will have two speakers, is co-sponsored by the Institute of European Studies here at UC Berkeley. Housekeeping, please turn off cell phones. Okay. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. Today's event is called Populism in the Far Right, Global Fireworks and Local Crises.
Almost. Global frameworks. I like fireworks.
I like fireworks too. It is called frameworks and it is not fireworks, but you know, I offer people pick and choose as you see fit. Okay. All right. And today we will have two presentations. I will introduce each of the speakers before their remarks. At the end, we'll do all the questions and answers. People who are online can use the Q&A feature to ask questions. People who are here, please hold your questions until the end of the second speaker, fireworks notwithstanding. So, our first speaker is Amy Skonieczny, and it's a pleasure to introduce her. Amy Skonieczny is a professor of international relations at San Francisco State University and is here with the center as a visiting scholar this year. Her research focuses on the rise of right-wing populism in the United States. Dr. Skonieczny has her publications over the past 5 years have focused on the rise of populism in the United States, particularly with the Trump presidency. She is co-editor of a book series, Global Populisms, and is a board member of the journal Populism. She has several recent publications, including The Trump Shock, Populism and Changing Narratives, the U.S. Policy and Populist Foreign Policy, Regional Perspectives. Dr. Skonieczny has a very interesting topic, one that doesn't get a lot of attention, or not near enough. She will talk about, does populism have a global vision? Right-wing populism and the reimagining of global governance. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Skonieczny.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at UC Berkeley. We're just over on the other side at San Francisco State, and I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm delighted to be able to make connections at Berkeley and be a part of the Center for Right-Wing Studies. I've been studying right-wing populism in international relations for a while now, and it's nice to make the connections here, and I'd like to grow the network. So if you're a student, a graduate student, if you're from San Francisco State, I see some of my students out here too. I'm happy to connect with you. My email will be at the end, and I would love to talk to you more about my research and what we're doing at San Francisco State in my department. Let's see, forward. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm working on a project this year on populist global governance. In international relations, we've looked at populism just like you have in other disciplines, sociology, political science, and other disciplines. But one of the things we noticed in looking at our research and taking a kind of like a a beat on what is going on in studying right-wing populism, particularly with the rise of Trump's second term and like another round of Trump and populism, and of course the global element that's going on around the world right now. My co-authors and I have a collaboration of scholars that I've worked with over the years, and we were discussing this global element of populism and wondering a little bit about, what's the connections between populists around the world. We've heard, of course, that there are, we often think of it as a domestic source of populism. And we know that there are commonalities and patterns across different countries and with populist leaders. So we kind of already have a little bit of that going on with the research. But we really, I think, in many ways, aren't looking at it enough through a global lens. And so that's kind of what our project is attempting to do this year. This is a relatively new project. We've talked about it. I now have a research sabbatical to work on it. And so I'm really excited to kind of dive in, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on this project as it unfolds. So one of the things I think that if you pay attention to the rise of the right, and especially with Trump and other populist leaders, is they tend to really shock the system in what they're doing in foreign policy. And that's kind of, as Dr. Rosenthal introduced me, with the nature of my research has been looking at the Trump shock and American foreign policy changing norms, and in many ways kind of tearing down or undermining traditional institutions that the US has relied on in their foreign policy making. So we kind of know that, but we were curious to know if they're just tearing down these institutional norms, the institutional rules, if they're just norm breakers, if they're just trying to disrupt, or are they trying to build something new? And that's kind of like the underlying question that we're looking at. And then we asked, what does that mean for global governance? Because in international relations, we talk about the liberal international order and global governance system. And we kind of were trying to say, okay, there's been a lot of literature on that, but from a populist standpoint, what would that look like? Could we start to imagine that? So we're asking this question, and then a part of our argument as we're developing this project is populist actors are not only eroding these rules, which we think of as like a thin layer of governance or rules of behavior, and contesting norms, which would be more of a midway that they're disrupting. But we're really interested in wondering, are they recoding a moral foundational order that's on par with the liberal foundational order of global governance into something different, maybe a bounded cosmopolitanism, and I'll get into that in a minute. The common definition in international relations, for those of you that are looking at this from far right, from sociology or political science, maybe comparative politics, that's kind of like tends to be, I think, where the idea of the far right comes out. In international relations, we talk about populism. This is a little bit different. It's not exactly the far right. It comes out of democratic systems. It tends to arise by voting, right? These are when populist leaders or parties are being elected into office. The common definition that's used in our literature is something called populism as a thin-centered ideology, where the society is divided between the pure people and the corrupt elite. That is kind of the bailiwick benchmark here of, is it a populist? And then the idea is that populists should express the general will of the true people, and there often is a leader that's in charge with returning power to these true people and wrestling it away from the corrupt elite. Now, that in itself is not a very thick ideology. It's pretty thin. So it attaches to other things like nationalism on the right. We see nationalism, civilizational, or nativism, you might have heard. Or sometimes on the left-wing you heard of left-wing populism in Latin America and other places. Even in the US, we have left-wing populists that talk more about equality, equity frames, or anti-austerity. Now, our research is solidly looking at right-wing populism and really how it attaches to kind of nationalist authoritarianism. But one of the things we notice, as I've claimed already, is that we see that there's already a global element to populism. So we're trying to flip on its head that it's only domestic, or that it can only be compared country to country. And I've done plenty of that in my research. We notice things like populism is diffused across movements, across leaders, across rhetoric, and narrative. They tend to repeat similar phrasing and similar tropes and visions when they're talking, different leaders. They tend to do things like they're against institutions, or they tend to erode institutional constraints. They're more transactional. You might have heard this. Things like that. So there's patterns here. And this is diffused, meaning they're learning from one another. That's the main thing we notice. They're learning. So during COVID-19, I did a research project that looked at COVID-19 responses from populist leaders. We looked at 4 different countries, and we noticed the way the rhetoric, just solely looking at the way it was talked about, spread as the virus spread, as responses spread across different leaders, like Modi in India and Bolsonaro in Brazil. Even we looked at in Mexico, AMLO was also using some similar types of kind of COVID talk about the virus and treatments, et cetera. And of course, we had Trump that was doing this. So there's learning and emulation across leaders. And so this is showing that there's a performance element to populism on a global stage. And sometimes it's used to legitimate what they're doing domestically, to kind of give them extra power, going back home and using it there. But nonetheless, there's already a constitutively global element, we argue, to populism. So then we thought, okay, let's look at this global governance literature and try to unpack, what does global governance mean from a liberal point of view, because it's innately liberal as a project. And again, we're thinking of global governance institutions that took shape after World War II, architects, right, the US and Western Europe primarily, and Britain. And ironically, these are really the hotbeds of this right-wing populist movement. With Brexit, you had this in Britain. And then, of course, with Trump in the United States, you get kind of an anti-liberal component, wanting to unpack and undo an architecture that's really been favorable to both of these countries for years. So in many ways, it's now moving to the center here, in terms of the center of the liberal order is now being eroded. And we're kind of wondering, what does that mean? So global governance as an idea is both an institutional architecture, and here we think of like the WTO, right, the UN, NATO, and other big architectural elements that hold it together, but it's also a moral order. And this is where I think more research needs to be centered. What is the moral order of the liberal order? It's not neutral, it's not universal. We can see that. This is in part why right-wing populists have a hard time with many of the directives that are coming through liberalism and through the liberal order. It's grounded in competing value claims about who's included, what obligations exist, and how authority is justified. It's passed off as neutral, but we already know it's not. We've already had critiques on the left from the global South and others who have thought this is very Western. This is not universal. It's rooted in Western Europe, actually. So we have the left side critiquing the liberal order for decades. And now we have the right critiquing this global order from a different perspective. So much global governance scholarship presumes liberal democracy standards of legitimacy, but populists contest these premises, and we're looking at what are their rival moral claims. We don't have all the answers yet, so this is what we're interested in finding out more about. So we did a comparison of looking at from a framework standpoint. Okay, from liberal standpoint, from global governance literature, you have kind of like this thin to thick spectrum. On the thin side, meaning like this is, think of democracy, right? You can have democracy being kind of thin, and then you can have it really be more thick, okay? So on the thin side of liberalism and liberal global governance, you have rules-based reciprocity. So if you think of an institution, you want to know that the parties are going to adhere to the rules. This is to alleviate fears of cheating or being the sucker, right? That's kind of like the classic, if you're an IR or political scientist, this is the Krasner-Cohen ideas of institutions needing some rules, needing to reduce the transaction costs, to kind of minimize harm and risk taking for those to give up some sovereignty in order to get gains. In the mid-level of institutions and liberalism, you have norm socialization. This is coming from those like Finnemore, Sicking, Barnett, if you understand the literature here, which is this idea that institutions then have norms that are attached to them, meanings, and even identities. You go so far as saying identities. You're now a democracy, so you're going to participate in the WTO, for example. That's like you want to be part of the in crowd with the democracy states, but then you need to be socialized. You need to behave like a democracy. Okay, not just adhere to the rules, but you want to have those rules become embedded as part of your identity. On the thickest side, and this is not really looked at, I don't think, it's not very much anymore. It kind of fell out of fashion, I guess, in democracy studies, which is this moral cosmopolitanism. This is the David Held, for those political scientists out there, the Richard Fox, Archibudi, an Italian scholar. Shout out to my Italian friends out here, who are looking at thick democratic practices. It's really about a vision of a democratic world where the individual is at the center, meaning you're removing the boundaries of states and you're looking at universal values, freedoms, rights, equality. So it's coming out of a philosophical bent. It's a vision. It's like an ideal type. It's hard to achieve that in today's society, but you're kind of progressing towards that. So rights progress towards that vision. Now, on the populist model, what we look at, what if populists, how do they fit into this? How do they see this? On the thin side, populists see institutions as, transactional. They're more transactional in nature with their alliances. If it works because it fits your interest, you're going to be part of NATO, for example. But if it doesn't really work very well, like the WHO, or you feel like it's not the WTO, for example, the US is basically it's non-functional for the US right now. They'd rather go bilateral and make their deal than go through those big institutions anymore. So they're not really using them. You can also use veto obstructions. You can obstruct from within. You can forum shop, meaning you can go around and be like, yes, I'll go to the G7 and et cetera, but I'm not going to show up here. So you don't have a very strong relationship to these institutions anymore, which erodes them. If people like the United States and other populist countries don't participate in them or even like break some of the rules, well, then others are going to start doing that as well. So then it's not going to have much power. It's not going to be very legitimate. For the mid-level, we see norm contestation. This is really where the literature is looked at. Counter norms. You see this all the time with the Trump administration, saying things that were kind of taboo, right? He's good at saying things that are taboo, even suggesting that the US might not be part of NATO. That was a big third rail, but he's gone there. Saying things about alliances, kind of like pulling out of the Geneva Convention, not being part of the human rights, stuff like that. Now, when it comes to the thickest level of cosmopolitanism or this vision of sort of like this moral code here, we don't know yet. This is where we're landing. What is the underlying moral element that populists want or desire? And I think there's a lot of work going on around the world right now, and I'm going to show you some examples of where we're going here, where populist leaders are really starting to look at morality more and make more of an impact on this, eroding the moral code of liberalism. So we looked at, again, David Held is kind of like the benchmark for moral cosmopolitanism. It's this idea that humankind belongs to a single moral realm in which each person is equally worthy of respect and consideration, no matter where you live, no matter what color your skin, no matter what your national identity is, for example. So this is kind of like the crux of liberalism, right? Human freedom and equality. It rests on the principle of equal moral worth of all individuals. And this principle undermines kind of a cosmopolitan democracy, which is the idea that globalization produces interdependence and therefore requires democratic institutions to uphold rights and accountabilities so all can achieve this. So this is like the goal, again, for liberalism. So now what would be a populist reframing of this moral universalism? If we think about who matters under liberalism, we see that all people are equal. It's always back down to the individual, like no matter how much money you have or where you were born, you have the same equal rights. Whereas under populism, you tend to have the true people. The people they're bounded, right? You have a certain true people that are in. that you belong. It could be the nation, but it could also be within the nation. So we see this, again, it's a little bit of an amorphous idea. Who are the people in the United States that matter? Is it the heartland? You sometimes hear that term. Is it sort of like, you know, where are these people located? Is it rural? Is it the working class? Sometimes you hear those terms with populists. So there's, again, not all people are equal. Under obligation, there's universal duties to each individual and human rights, whereas under populism, the duties are bound to the civilization, the nation, the national identity. That's where you get nativism. Nativism is coming from nationalism. And again, I could go through all of these here, but you kind of get the idea that we're really looking at comparing what are the crux of the moral code under liberalism and trying to find out what is the equivalent here under populism. So I want to give us some ideas, and I can take up some of these in our discussion if you want. So when we're looking at how are populists remaking a moral cosmology or have a moral vision, I think we're seeing some things like when it comes to values, we're really seeing this term referred to about patriots versus globalists. For example, the US uses this term. This is so interesting. The idea of a patriot, and you hear this more on the right, of course. So sometimes it sounds funny if you're more living in Berkeley, you're like, wait, what is going on? But this language is happening at the international level, at the global level, in global talks to the UN, in global discourse, where Trump is using these terms, patriots, etc. In other countries, they are picking up they have their own version of this language. So in Italy, for example, I just returned from Pavia in Italy last month, where I taught a class and really got to know some people that are working on the right wing in Italy. It was great connection. They were talking about Meloni and the way she uses this idea of God, country, family, and faith, etc., as one of her tropes that she's using. Other countries have used similar types of national, or signals to nationalism. But what I think is really interesting and something to pay attention here is what are the issues where they're starting to gather, not just, oh, we're against immigration or we like borders or something like that, but there's a morality attached to it. So the family and gender, this is a huge area of moral contestation. Okay, they tend to claim it as religion, Christianity, or Muslim. It doesn't really matter what religion, because of course Erdogan in Turkey is also doing the same thing. But you see, for example, the US saying, you know, you're assigned sex at birth, and we're not going to support any legislation internationally that says otherwise. Of course, the abortion issues internationally, but this is spread. Okay, and also they're learning from one another. So Hungary tends to be a test case. The US is now applying much of the language on gender and family and teaching about LGBTQ issues in schools, and all the stuff we're kind of seeing in Florida and now elsewhere around the United States is coming straight out of a playbook where it's been done in other countries, Turkey and Hungary to be exact, and then of course in other places. Migration is not just the issue of immigration, but it's it's a moral governance issue. It's becoming more moral about sovereignty first is our right. We have sovereigntist rights and nationalist rights. They're taking it as more of a moral stance than just the thin level, like we have rules and, you know, you need to go through this asylum thing. And that's a rule-based way of looking at it. But we're seeing much, much thicker associations with migration and why populists are against migration or have issues with immigration all across different areas, different countries. And then I think now we're at Berkeley here, right? We're in the university. This is really, I think, a newish for the US epistemic attack on universities and education. We're seeing this strongly now under the second Trump administration. This wasn't really an issue under the first administration, where they're looking at academic freedom. They're trying to say universities are pushing a certain moral agenda that's more liberal. They're looking at grants and taking away funding. This happened in Turkey. This happened in Hungary under populist leaders. And now we're seeing the same thing happening in the US. It's about morality in a way, because it's saying you're going to send your sons and daughters and kids off to college, and they're going to become woke, and they're going to learn about, the US Constitution and the freedoms and stuff. And that's going to be, or equal rights with civil rights movements. And that's going to be a problem. You're not going to recognize your child at Thanksgiving. But that's, so they're coming after an epistemic order where they're not valuing scientific knowledge, etc. So there's a moral justification for this. It isn't just about rules or even norms anymore. So these are the three areas that we're focused on in our project, looking at rights and human rights, kind of like how this moral, this recoding is going on in reshaping an information order, what counts as knowledge. Of course, we see this in health and public health issues as well with the WHO, but we also saw it now with the CDC in the United States. I just saw that Trump is abolishing or trying to abolish the Department of Education, stuff like that. That really makes it apparent that they're going after similar kinds of issues that have happened in other countries. Rolling back DEI is another thing. And then I already mentioned things like the religious freedom, the call back to the traditional family, anti-gender language push, of course, attack on trans folk in particular here. So just to wrap up, so you can kind of get a sense of where we're headed, is we want to try to look at then, is there a global imaginary? Is there a rival populist order? How are they redefining morals and values? What does this rule bending lead to? Because if you think of liberalism starting with the basics of thin, like we're gonna cooperate, we're gonna come to some rules, getting thicker by having some norms for behavior, and then having a moral code. I think we're entering into the moral code progression here under populist regimes and connections. Of course, we have institutional practices too. They're not necessarily ending institutions, and my scholars that have looked at before would say they're hollowing them out, but we're wondering if they're remaking them, maybe not hollowing them out. They're making space for them. They're making them more flexible to adjust to some of their rules. Think of what's happening in Harvard and Columbia and other universities. They're not necessarily saying end this university, but we want space for different viewpoints. I mean, we're hearing this at San Francisco State. You want to make sure you're having all different viewpoints in your classroom. It's a way of expanding what counts as education, even if it isn't what is typically knowledge. So we're seeing a push there. Again, is it not really anti-global governance, but alter global governance? Is there a remaking here? So IR and others who are studying populism were saying must push forward to envision how are they creating an altered governance, or are they reimagining values? Are they rewriting the rules, remaking institutions? And are they starting to retell moral narratives about the family, for example? I think this is a really interesting one. They're really bringing in what is traditional family. We're hearing this a lot from the Republican Party in the United States. My area is more on the US, but we're here again, like it's happening in other places around the world. So populists counter not only those thin rules, but this thick moral code, and they're advancing some sort of rival cosmopolitanism and alter global governance vision. So our plan here, I'm working with a group of scholars. We've designed a special issue. It's going to be for Global Society, the journal that we're working on. I have a co-editor that we're working on this theoretical piece because we really want to try to get at the architecture of this. And then we have several scholars that we're working on. And ultimately, studying populism through the lens of global governance forces us to see it as a global project and a moral global project. And I think this is an avenue that's really underexplored in IR and probably political science and elsewhere. And we're hoping to push that forward. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really compelling and interesting talk. Thank you. Our next speaker is Valentina Nava. Valentina is, wait, I'm on the wrong thing here. Dear. Valentina is a visiting scholar from Italy who has spent this semester at the Center for Right-Wing Studies. Valentina is going to give a talk on an ethnography of a small town in northern Italy and the rise of support for the Fratelli d'Italia, which is the party that is currently in power in Italy, and is a right-wing populist party. And again, this will be a talk, and if you have questions, the questions will come for both speakers at the end. Valentina is a PhD candidate at the Université Paris Cité, and is from there that she has come to be a visiting scholar here at Berkeley, and she studies the contemporary appeal of the far right and the conditions under which neoliberal governments and governmentality converges with far right politics. So we proceed to this topic, and please help me welcome Valentina Nava.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad to be here today. So I wanted briefly to thank you, ISSI, for welcoming here in this semester that I've been visiting. Larry Rosenthal, of course, who is my supervisor at the Center for Working Studies, and every one of you who's here today, and also Abby for this wonderful presentation, and hopefully mine will be in dialogue with yours and giving perspective more from below with an ethnography. So let's start. I wanted to give you a more broad introduction to my research and why I choose this topic. So what we have seen in the past 15 years across many parts of the world has been this configuration of recurring financial crisis, deepening of neoliberal reforms, austerity policies, rising inequalities, and alongside all this, the growing success of far-right parties. So Italy is one of the places where these configurations have been the most visible. The consequences of the global crisis have hit particularly hard, widening pre-existing inequalities. So this country went through two technocratic governments in the past 15 years that implemented some of the most far-reaching austerity measures in Europe, and has weakened strongly trade unions and social movements. It is in this context of weakened trade unions and weakening social movements that Fratelli d'Italia, a party rooted in a post-fascist tradition, experienced a truly remarkable rise. It has passed from the 40% of the vote in 2018 to 26% of the vote in 2022. And for Giorgia Meloni and her supporters, this success was framed as a sort of like symbolic victory, sort of like reversal from the long exclusion that the Movimento Sociale Italiano had witnessed. So the neo-fascist party, who came directly from, let's say, the fascist party, and the party from which Fratelli d'Italia descends. So this configuration raises two fundamental questions, which are how do we make sense of the success of a party that until recently stood at the very extremes of the Italian political field, and more broadly, why are we witnessing this conservative, illiberal, and sometimes openly neo-fascist turn globally, precisely at a moment where inequalities are deepening and the working classes are experiencing profound downward mobility. So my dissertation tries to approach these questions humbly through an ethnographic study conducted in a left-wing rural area that very recently shifted to the far right. So here you can see one of the towns of the valley I did my fieldwork in. It's a mountainous area in the region of Emilia-Romagna, which is widely known as one of Italy's, let's say, symbolically left-wing regions. It remains a stronghold of the left, but the rural and the mountainous areas are now shifting progressively to the far right, very slowly. But this phenomenon has been going on since about 20 years. The valley where I did my fieldwork is close to the city of Bologna. I did about 100 interviews, spent long periods of time there, did participant observations in local associations, parish events, and neighborhood gatherings. This area once voted for the 60% of the votes for the Communist Party, so it's really one of the places in Italy that was one of the most, let's say, communist areas in Italy, and now they give about 30% of the vote for Fratelli d'Italia, and this shift away of the left-wing party has started about 10 years ago. I also did an archival research, and the need for this archival research really stemmed from the fieldwork, because people were continuously referring to the Communist Party in their discourses about the hegemony of the Communist Party, about the anti-fascist resistance that happened in the valley. And they often would talk about this in terms of saying things like, we must move on from that period, now we have to be something else. So they were keeping talking about wanting to move on from that identity, but it was so present in their discourses that it needed to be, let's say, researched. So I did mostly archival research in the state archives of Bologna. Here you can see a photo of the files of the sovversivi who were surveilled during the fascist regime. And so many of them came from this area, and it kind of shows that there was a strong, let's say, spread of communist and socialist and anarchist ideas in the valley. Many other things happened. There has been 19th century peasant riots, and a lot of events throughout the last 2 centuries, including basically this hegemony of the Communist Party, that was not only a political agent, of course, but more importantly, even a force of social cohesion for this community. So here you can see, a completely informal communist space that I encountered while walking in this town called Campolo. And it was a very nice discovery because, of course, like everything that passes on the informal level is not documented in the archives. So you kind of have to, keep on walking around, pay attention to the details, and try to talk to people and see what is not emerging from the archives. And all these buildings, they call them Case del Popolo in Italy, so the house of the people. All these informal spaces were, of course, agents. They were organizing the daily life. It was a really capillary network of activists that were doing like really grassroots politics in the valley. They were organizing festivals. The main event there was the Festa dell'Unità. So everything was really revolving around the Communist Party there. And of course, when it dissolved in the 90s, the Communist Party dissolved in the early 90s, many experienced this as a kind of collective trauma. So in the interviews, it really comes very often to this gradual erosion of the Communist Party, and therefore also the political fabric that once sustained this collective life. So together with this process, there has also been, with the global crisis, the deterioration of material conditions, as the employment opportunities in the valley have declined really sharply. Many industrial jobs have disappeared. It is an area that is witnessing deindustrialization. People increasingly have to look for work in the city. So in Bologna, commuting for long distances and losing quality of life. I heard many stories of shopkeepers that are struggling to survive, to keep their commerces open. And as a result, the commercial streets are emptying out. And the residents call these towns and this street as really a ghost town effect. You really have this sense while walking in the towns that there had been something more glorious. So people tell you, oh, before you could buy clocks there. There was so many specific commerces that don't exist anymore. And also poverty has risen significantly. So if you think about the fact that it's enormous, but 1/3 of the residents today earn less than 15,000 euros per year, and the richest have gained even more in the last decade. The local workforce shrunk by 25%, with peaks of 30 to 40% in some municipalities. And this affected, of course, all the segments of the working class, so workers, employees, business owners, artisans, and farmers. And many people I interview feel that since the financial crisis, their conditions have steadily worsened. So I interview more, the majority of the people I interviewed are people that voted for the Communist Party and for the center left until a certain moment, and that recently shifted to the far right. So in this configuration, there is clearly a vacuum that opens up, and it is in this vacuum of missing social fabric and poverty that the far right has been able to impose their narrative. And I wanted to show you some of my interviews. That will be more later. I always prefer to talk more from the interviews than from a upper point of view. So these are phrases that people told me after long interviews. Usually in the beginning, people tend more to share how lucky they are in their life, how they don't want to complain, they want to give a positive, optimistic vision of themselves. And then after maybe a couple of hours, you can sense another story that comes up. So they can say things like, here in the mountains, they're doing everything they can to force us to leave. And when you ask them, who are they? Who is this they? They say, well, the politicians, the people that governed until now. Before there was, someone else says, before there was a middle class, a lower class, and an upper class, and now only the upper class is left. And we have fallen into misery. So this kind of sense of the middle class that doesn't exist anymore is really in their own perception. And also the urban-rural cleavage is very present. So I can't talk about it today, but this like symbolic division between the city and the rural is like very, very present. So they say in the city everything goes better than here. It seems like it's decided that we must be poor. So this idea that there is like that there is a sense that something has been decided by someone, and that they are living in this reality right now. And so what matters to me is not whether each individual that I interviewed personally experienced economic decline, but the fact that this community as a whole, let's say, lives it as a shared narrative. In this very interconnected rural context, of course, everything becomes like very shared. And I really like how Phil Neal describes, from a very Marxist and materialist point of view, the urban-rural cleavage in America, and he talks about this sense of communality that comes from being increasingly surplus to the economy, though also paradoxically being integral to that. So there is this sense of like perceived economical marginalization, and of course, ethnographers of the rural world knows that they have the difficult task from one side not to essentialize these rural areas as the white Trumpist in this case, or in Italy, far right, working class and conservative, etc. But from the other side, have to describe the material struggle of these people. So it's always very difficult to know how to do that in a proper way without essentializing these areas too much. And of course, this shared sense of loss might or might not translate into a far right vote, but it also could be transformed in something else. But my opinion is that this is not possible precisely because the social fabric is not how can I say, homogeneous anymore. It's not entangled anymore. And in my vision, this is the result of years and years and years of neoliberal policies of austerity that were really, really strong in Italy, that created new moral grammars, actually, and shape who deserves help, who does not deserve it, who brings wealth to the society and who doesn't. And it kind of obscures how the choices are made and how the wealth is actually dealt with in a state. So I'm about to conclude already. I missed only 2 slides, but I wanted to show you an ethnographic vignette to give you a more really material sense of the stories that I encountered during my fieldwork. So this is the story of Giulia and Andrea, just like many other configurations that I encountered in my fieldwork. They're in their 40s, they have 4 children. Giulia has a small shop. She doesn't earn almost anything from that, even though she's open all the time. She thinks it's the fault of Amazon and the fault of internet, because she sells goods for babies. Andrea works in a local factory, and they are what we could say working poor, meaning that they work a lot, but still they can't earn enough. So they rely on welfare aid, and they receive roughly 1,200 euro per month. And they both come from communist, let's say, voting tradition families, which is something very, very common in the Valley. They voted long time for the center left, and recently they shifted to Brothers of Italy. So they say that the left no longer defends workers' interests, and this is a phrase that a lot of people told me. If the Communist Party still existed, I would vote for it. So for who is familiar with the Italian context, Berlinguer, so the most famous chief of the Communist Party, is really like this figure that is still beloved in the community, and people say, oh, if Berlinguer was here, I would vote for him. And it's interesting to me that they know exactly that the far right won't do better than the left, their economic interest. But they say, just like Giulia says to me, at least Meloni doesn't want to give money to the immigrants. And she goes on and she says, with all the benefits they get, they have cards for groceries, they have this and they have that, things that we Italians can even dream of. They come into our home, they come here because it's an invasion. They want to integrate, and they don't want to work either. And his husband says, because he was complaining about social housing, complaining that this famous fake news rhetoric that social housing predominantly goes to the immigrants. So he says, okay, you want to come and stay in social housing, fine, but I'll build social housing in front of the factory and you're going to work and live there. So all the narrative, all the claims that the people I encountered have are really based on the fact that the immigrants don't work, they don't contribute enough to the economy of the valley. And just to wrap up and close my argument, what emerges very strongly from the fieldwork is the shift in how people make sense of economical insecurity. And as life becomes more precarious and future horizons contract, people increasingly rely on meritocratic criteria to decide who deserves welfare and care. These criteria are often articulated through processes of racialization, and the axis of competition is no longer centered on labor. So you don't hear any more phrases like, oh, immigrants come here and steal our jobs, because there's no job anymore. So it's really people come here and they steal our resources, the resources that we earn because we pay the taxes and we work. And this, of course, makes probably a lot of sense to you because it is exactly what is happening in the US. And so the question that Amy asked before is very relevant. Is there something as a moral grammar happening globally that makes sense of all this phenomenon? So once again, this claim that immigrants and welfare recipients also, they are often imagined as deserving more than they should, while locals feel under-recognized and left behind. And in this context, there's a sense of respectability that comes as residual status. People are drawing from moral worth, from the idea that they have worked hard, being useful, and even in this configuration, their material condition declined. So labor no longer guarantees security, but continues to function symbolically for this community as the key marker of who belongs and who doesn't. And to conclude, what we see is a reframing of the social space where people engage in moral evaluation, not only to defend their own interests, but to make sense of a world in which the guarantees that once sustained them have largely disappeared. So voting for the far right appears to be, in a way, the last remaining resource for them to defining themselves positively and confronting a trajectory of social decline. Thank you.
We have looking at the world at a macro level and looking at a world at a micro level and talking about essentially very similar things. And I think that in both cases, the focus has been quite compelling. We will take questions from the audience, and we will take some from the internet as well. Let me just ask a couple of questions to each of them before we start, or call this the start. For Amy, I was really struck by your saying, is something new being built? I was struck by the word new. What about what is old? In other words, in what you're describing, is this new formation drawing heavily from what was before the liberal world? I mean, tariffs and nationalism and the absence of international organizations. To what extent do you think this is drawing on that which came before. And Valentina, I was wondering, when you spoke, you talked about the arc of about 15 years and the deterioration of life for working people in Italy, which is so reminiscent of what we have lived with here. So I'm curious, in this period of time, we've had a number of different populist right formations in Italy. We had Cinque Stelle, Five-Star Movement, which Steve Bannon thought was the future of the world at one point, but they had something. They approached 30%, I think, in an election, and you pointed out that Fratelli d'Italia has gone from 4 to 20%. Those kind of transformations have been notable. Is there some reason, or do you believe that what is going on at the hands of Fratelli d'Italia differs from these previous things? Also, the Lega was another one, and you could even talk about Forza Italia, which was a populism of a different epoch altogether. I think it's fair to say. So I'm wondering if you perceive the rise and affiliation to Fratelli d'Italia as something perhaps with more hold, or likely to continue to hold more than these previous ones. So with that, please.
Okay.
Amy, you want to start?
Oh, sure. Okay, I love this idea, drawing on the past. Are populists currently building something new, or are they reminiscing or recalling something from the past? And I saw that also in Valentina's talk as well, where people, and we see this in the United States too, they're hearkening back in a way to something that was before, some glory. Like, I love that thing. If I was in a town and I noticed there's residue of glory in the past, like some glorious past that now is really like, not the same. And that just sounded so much like, Detroit or Michigan, some other spot, where you feel like, oh, this used to be, really this was the place where people came, they had jobs, there was a middle class, all that talk. And in some ways it's hearkening back. So I see, and when you think of it from an international sense or international relations sense, is it going back to really much more of a system that was sovereign, where you're focusing on the sovereign states, kind of like serving their own interests and not necessarily cooperating at the global scale that we saw with the liberal order after World War II, where you're really looking at institutional constraints, institutional ideas, the United Nations as the, kind of like the epic of that. I think the difference about going back to a system before the liberal order is there really is no total return to that, because now we're so enmeshed with one another under globalization. You cannot, put that genie back in the bottle. So you're always now going to have an interconnectedness that will not go away, even if for some reason the UN wasn't there anymore or some of these founding institutions were gone. I think we're still interconnected as in humanity, as people, and we're always going to search for some form of cooperation, because I think that does serve interests, and beyond that, that's just what has been practiced for a long time. So I think in a way that what we're looking at here is not going back to total sovereignty, because even under tariffs, there are still a lot of negotiations. There's still a lot of cooperation happening. You can't totally return to a time before, but the narrative of bringing back something from the past, I think, is extremely important to the right. That, and again, it's a little bit mythical, because it didn't maybe exist in that exact way, but there is a myth of the past returning. And so I think that's interesting to think through. What would be the myth of the past that's embedded in this idea of, like, can we form a liberal or populist global governance order or something like that?
I mean, each of these movements talks about a golden age.
Oh, totally.
You know, make America great again.
Yeah.
What you're suggesting is, was there an international global age which might be a model?
Yeah.
So, Valentina?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, just so I think nostalgia is a key element concerning this discussion on the role of the past. But yeah, concerning your question, Larry, I think that the Italian case has always been, as you were saying, the sort of like political laboratory of Europe and also globally in a way. So we had Berlusconi before Trump. Cinque Stelle was also in a way very, very new. It kind of like anticipated even though it was not a purely leftist movement, but this hybrid kind of like anticipated what then came in Spain in a way. This like demand for democracy from below. And Fratelli d'Italia also makes sense in this configuration of anticipating or anyway living in the contemporary appeal for the far right. I don't know if I can say that of course I can't say what will come next, but Fratelli d'Italia is still very popular in Italy. So when you look at the polls, it's still very, very high. It's always at 28, 30% of the preferences, which is even more than 3 years ago. So, and talking to the people that I interviewed, they are still very happy with what the government is doing, and they are not, well, they're generally, I mean, they're not supporters, right? They're not like cheering for Giorgia Meloni. In the majority of them is not. But there is something about, maybe that could be compared with what we see with Trump. This being like, okay, maybe now the economical situation is still not good, but I trust him. Just like people say, I trust Giorgia Meloni, so I trust that later it will be better in a way. It's kind of faith in there, in these leaders.
Good, thank you. Dylan.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talks. I think they were both really interesting, really important. I want to suggest that in a way they're getting from different perspectives at one phenomenon, which is the collapse of the communist alternative. So if we think about the international order, the collapse of the international order, I think, is driven by the U.S. and it really begins not under Trump, but most obviously, you could say with the invasion of Iraq, and it is an expression very much of a completely unconstrained global power. That, of course, Trump is, in a sense, working with the degree, but the process of ignoring, international law and, utter kind of cynicism about, the International Criminal Court, using when convenient and ignoring when inconvenient the United Nations. Obviously, all these things go back to the unipolar moment. And so I just wonder whether liberal internationalism is not always really a Cold War phenomenon, and should be put very firmly in that context. And of course, this goes obviously to Valentina's presentation as well, which is just, obviously the rise of Fratelli d'Italia, recent phenomenon, and so on and so forth, but the underlying condition here is the suicide of the Italian Communist Party, coincidence on the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had domestic political effects in Italy that are really completely unique, I would say, in the advanced capitalist world. So in a way, what I think you may be grasping from different sort of vantage points is the kind of long-term effects of essentially the collapse of the communist alternative and how that then washed back and ricocheted back, over a long period into both global and domestic politics. So I was just wondering what you guys think about that sort of broader context.
Yeah. I think that's, you're making some great points here, which is there are, the liberal international order has already been there's been a lot of talk of it being in decline. Same with American hegemony being in decline. This has been a talk for a while. And you raised the issue of the unipolar moment as this idea that there isn't really a global order. It's a global order sustained by the U.S. and U.S. interests that serve the U.S. power. That is kind of like I would say that's been around for a while as a criticism of the U.S. that it kind of uses, international institutions to its advantage when it wants and then doesn't when it doesn't. This is the same critique that you might have about human rights. The U.S. talks a good human rights game, but then we know, of course, for decades, the U.S. has violated human rights and even democratic practices, and not just with Iraq, but other places as well. So I think that those are all underlying components, right? It's not out of nowhere. Just like what Valentina's saying about economic decline. Economic decline has like the global economic recession or the housing crisis in the U.S. These big global shock moments of neoliberalism really hurting the poor, really creating a hollowing out of the middle class. Those give conditions, I think, for the right to rise. That has been one of the notable causes of the rise of right-wing populism, I think. So you have kind of like these two things going on as conditions, I would say. However, I do think there is something about right-wing populist leaders who lean more towards the authoritarian side of things, more nationalist authoritarian side of things, winning elections, not just having a party or a part of parliament, but actually becoming leaders and now becoming, yes, maybe the US is in decline or something, but it's still a hegemon. It still continues to exist as a global power. And what I think you're hearing is different rhetoric and different practices that are more quickly eroding it from itself, even though before, if you think about Iraq served US's interests, right? But does it serve US interests to, collapse or threaten to collapse the liberal order? Not really. So there's something else behind this. At the same time, George W. Bush, for example, talked a lot about freedom and human rights, and even while invading Iraq, wanting to bring democracy. Trump isn't really doing that. He's, in fact, kind of going in the opposite direction when it comes to human rights. So I think there is something different, but I think absolutely agree. There's already conditions that make this possible that aren't just about these leaders themselves or even what they stand for on the right.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting what you say about the fact that there's no credible alternative economy proposition. So, I mean, someone might also go on my fieldwork and talk to one person, and this person will say, well, I will not vote for the left anymore in my life, because for the Democratic Party anymore in my life, because it has done such terrible reforms, eroding the workers' right law in the past 15 years. So you might as well go to my fieldwork day one, and this is the solution, and and that's no other things, because this is of course incredibly relevant. I often ask myself, if another force was present in Italy or also locally, like a leftist presence with a very strong discourse on precariousness and workers' rights, would something change? And I think that even though everyone I interviewed is really agreeing with the ideology that the far right is proposing, so closing the borders, let's say, limiting LGBTQI rights. So they agree with what Giorgia Meloni is doing from all the points of view, let's say, but still, I think that if there was a credible mainstream party in the left, probably you could still manage to bring these people from the right to the left again. Because I mean, the Communist Party has never been an anti-racist party. It has never been like these were not questions that were actually present in the day-to-day political life. So, of course, this matters a lot. Yeah.
Let me add a footnote. You referred to the Democratic Party, the left alternative. This is the successor party to the Italian Communist Party.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, these are the heirs of the Communist Party. Yeah.
Okay. We have some question. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the Zoom audience. Okay. For Amy, what social structures and intellectual frameworks help define the movement of alternate global governance? Where does NatCon, which is national conservatism, which now meets all over the world, NatCon figure into the scholarship? And Valentina, your analysis portrays Fratelli d'Italia as a party that has managed to maintain a clear ideological identity. How do you interpret the role of Giorgia Meloni in the process of identity construction? And I would add from another question, what is the place of religion in that identity? Okay.
Do you want to take a couple extra questions?
Okay, shall we do that? Are you more comfortable with that?
Yeah. Do you
Okay.
think, is that okay?
There was someone who had a question in the back there.
Thank you so much once again for your presentations. Amy, I'm wondering about the extent to which the erosion of the liberal order is actually a deterioration of its very terms. I wonder about the extent to which the moral code of liberalism has been historically compromised by liberalism's role as the ideological backbone of capitalism. I think that liberalism's discourse of equality and fraternity has quite often served as a cover for the colonial capitalist project around the world. And I'm wondering about the extent to which the rise of right-wing populism essentially serves as a dark shadow of the same liberal world order that it is contesting as a result of the ongoing crises of capitalism. Val, I would love for you to expand upon the last response you gave about the potential value of a left alternative. I'm curious about how that could be built from the ground up, given what you said about how the material basis for such an alternative had disappeared from places like the town where you worked. And you talked as well about how this has led to a kind of trauma from the loss of social cohesion. So I suppose I'm also wondering how that trauma could be healed through base building.
Do you want to respond now or take another?
Maybe to respond.
Let's
Okay,
let's respond.
I can respond. I think, okay, great question, by the way, and great questions from online as well. In terms of, there's a couple of different things, and they kind of, in some ways, go together. One is, what is the philosophical root? Are there philosophical roots here that are giving rise to what might be a global populist response to liberalism? And I don't really know exactly the answer. I have some ideas, and this is something that we're undertaking for research. So the person on Zoom that wrote that question about national conservatism and other kinds of shared conversations that are going on. I mean, you mentioned Steve Bannon going around the world and CPAC and others who've now gone to Hungary and they hold conventions, and there is a shared discourse, and there are philosophers that they read and etc. Just like fascism kind of has a philosophical root, etc. And so we're kind of trying to explore what would that be and who's guiding this, who's guiding the philosophical moral code here. It's Trump is not doing that, so it's some other people that are advising him. But there does seem to be collaboration and sharing of information around the world. So if you have ideas, I'd love to hear more who you're thinking of. So please email me, whoever wrote that. Again, we're pursuing this over this project. But I think it's really interesting to think about what's the materialist component here. It's interesting because most of my research connected before this on populism has been on the economic stuff. I focus on trade and economy. That's more my zone, actually. But this project, I didn't even mention it. So it's like the first time really talking about morality and liberalism apart from the economy, which is, you can't really do, right? They're very interconnected. So I see what you mean about that. The interesting thing is that I don't think the right, as Valentina points out too, is offering an alternative to capitalism at all. So they're also going along with the capitalist project. In fact, of course, in the US, we see this just not only pushing forward for billionaires to be a part of decision making, which is just really, that's like beyond the pale, I think, from what we typically see, and a lot of corruption. A lot of embedded corruption just out, Saudi Arabia, okay, there's so many corrupt ties with Trump's family and Saudi Arabia. With tariffs, there's also like wheeling and dealings going on behind the scenes. So it isn't really offering a left, like an anti-capitalist vision. I think if we think about the anti-capitalist vision, which we could probably look back to anti-globalization, ultra-globalization movement, that was actually really picking up steam. We had the 99% thing, the 1% versus 99%. I mean, there was a global movement of alter globalization that was pretty much squashed because of 9/11. So had 9/11 not happened, we might have seen more of a vision. And now it's kind of like pretty much they're set up to be critiqued as terrorists, or any kind of communist alternative is really quickly stamped down through security means, actually by force. So that's really interesting. So I think we could kind of see like what happened there as an alternative. But the fact that there isn't really an economic vision, I think, doesn't bode well for right-wing populists, actually, because the rubber's going to hit the road. I mean, the U.S. economy can't sustain itself forever. We see, look at what's going on there. They can talk a good game about religion and identity and traditional values, but people's pocketbooks matter to them. So it is telling. I think there needs to be some sort of economic component, but again, that's missing to me. It's not being delivered on the right either. So the left has an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I will try to be very brief. So concerning the question of the role of Giorgia Meloni, well, she is absolutely she has like a very important, she is the party. Also, when you look at like the configuration of Fratelli d'Italia, you really see like this pyramid where there's Giorgia Meloni still now taking all the decisions, and then there is a very little circle around her, and then everything gets spread. But the party is her. So also concerning the ideological point of view, this matters, of course, but there has been some little transformations from like 10 years ago until now. She was Eurosceptical in 2013. She's not now. She goes hand by hand with von der Leyen as an ally for anti-immigrant policies in the EU. But she has this very, very strong role. And what I see in my fieldwork, what was actually decisive in her campaign was the fact that she was at the opposition of the technocratic government that was there in 2018, and the fact that she really managed to give this image of herself as someone coming from the working class, as someone who didn't need, let's say, positive discrimination policies that really build her own career by itself, even though it's completely artificial and not true. People really empathize with this like working class rhetoric. Concerning the role of religion, well, this area, since the Communist Party was so strong in Italy, where the Communist Party was strong, the church was like less strong in a way, but still religion matters in a way that it became culture. So religion doesn't matter anymore in the way that I've gone to church and there's not many people in churches there right now, but it matters because it became, of course, like secularized, like the values are in the culture, let's say, but it doesn't, I mean, God is not present in the interviews, if you want to say it like that. It's not like predominantly present. Like I encounter someone that goes to the church, etc., but it's more in the culture, let's say. And concerning your question, Pratik, about the leftist alternative, I don't know. I ask myself the same questions. One thing that is interesting is that there is municipalities that will vote overwhelmingly for the far right at the national vote, but they are still administrated by the left, because it's like families and families of mayors, and and people just trust them. But I think that something could be built from below. Maybe if maybe if young people didn't leave, maybe if unions came back stronger, because unions were quite important there. I also thought about myself going there in like 5 years and do politics, because it's there. You kind of see that it's possible. You kind of see that it's possible, but probably misses like more young people that of course are obliged to go away from the valley because there's no job.
Okay, I want to thank you both. I have to say, Valentina, I do look forward to you as a politician.
Yeah, definitely.
And I hope you all join me in thanking our two excellent speakers.